Hello and welcome back. I am very tired. I have worked a string of 12-hour days and I'm pretty fried, so bear with me as I do my best in this lecture. My goal is to get through the lecture for chapter 14 today, which should be possible if I refer you to your textbook for explanations, and I'll hit highlights and mention some things that could be, say, tricky to understand. I sent you guys a bunch of personality tests. They are fun and useful tools before class. If you could please do those, and then I'll discuss those instruments next class. For now, I'm going to pick up on our lecture for chapter 14. Last class, we were going through the stages of psychosexual development. Freud thought that the fundamental motivating factor was the libido, the sex drive, and that it developed through childhood such that personality was mostly fixed by puberty, but that as it developed, that development was focused on different erogenous zones. So Freud would think, well, a baby is putting things in its mouth and chewing on them because that's sort of sexually gratifying. That's not what a modern developmental psychologist would say. That's how they explore their world. Maybe their hands aren't as dexterous as adult hands are, and they feel much better, let's say, with their lips at times. That's a non-sexual explanation for that behavior. So we had left off at the phallic stage. So at this point, the erogenous zone is the genitals. Now what I'm about to say is often ridiculed. Your textbook mentions that Freud was very influenced by an ancient Greek play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. And in that play, Oedipus, there's something about incest. I can't remember. I'm too tired. It's been a long time since I've seen it. And so the textbook suggests that he has this idea because he's influenced by the play. In reality, Freud himself is doing some projecting. We assume that other people are like us, and maybe that our experiences could be universals. Freud had feelings for his mother, and those feelings made him feel sort of jealousy or hatred for his father. So that was a particular personal characteristic of Freud's. Freud learned about psychology through introspection, right? By thinking about his own experiences. And there is pros and cons to that. You can have some amazing insights, and maybe they just don't generalize to everyone. But Freud thought that what he went through is actually a universal stage that all little boys go through. All the males in this class, according to Freud, went through that in childhood, right? Being, like 5 years old and having sexual desire for your mother. That's a hard sell, right? But that's his theory. And the idea is that the little boy wants his mother, hates the father, but is also afraid of the father because, the father is bigger and more dominant, and eventually sort of resolves this by identifying with the father. So maybe you become psychologically like that same-sex parent. Sarah says, the incest thing is that Oedipus married and had children with his mom, but when he found out, he stabbed out his eyes. I don't think that's the best, coping strategy. But thank you for that. Now, Freud thought that little girls also underwent a psychological crisis at this time. So little girls are maybe noticing other siblings in the family. Maybe they're noticing the anatomy of their brothers. So around this time, they figure out that they are missing something really important. It was like one of the most important things to Freud. What does a girl not have? Psychologically devastating to realize you must go through life without one. Yeah, a penis. And it's sort of ridiculous. Anyway, Freud thought that the way that women ultimately navigate this psychological crisis is through like the heterosexual union with a man, because now you can experience penis. So according to his theory, at really around puberty, you have these heterosexual desires now, and also your personality has stabilized. Obviously, very easy to knock Freud. He was a major figure in the history of psychology. Actually, wasn't a psychologist. He was a neurologist, a medical doctor. Many of his ideas are unfalsifiable. If you go and think about those defense mechanisms, one of them is reaction formation, where because you feel threatened, you then have the opposite emotional experience. The example was a woman is in love with her coworker. That makes her feel uncomfortable, so therefore she starts to like hate him. That's reaction formation. But let's say, as a scientist, we'll make a prediction, and we predict that somebody will hate something, but actually they love it. We're wrong. Well, we can just add reaction formation as the escape hatch and still have the prediction therefore be right. Hey, that's unscientific. That's pseudoscientific. Freud's had a conception of the unconscious mind that you could question. One of you guys asked a really good question in last class. Someone said, like, what part of the brain is that in? Yeah, what lobe is the superego found in? Well, it doesn't really work like that, does it? The id is this abstract concept that refers to our animal nature, sex and aggression, and those things are real, and we can locate them in the brain, probably in the limbic system, the hypothalamus. But this idea that there is an unconscious mind and it has these parts to it hasn't really panned out. But we can talk about values, right? The superego is about values. I've sent you guys a values test. However, he's way ahead of his time in suggesting that there's an unconscious mind, because we really do for real have unconscious processes. And it's not that there's one unconscious mind. There's many multiple non-conscious processes that act in parallel to your conscious stream of thought. And he got us thinking and talking about it. And that's a big contribution. Another critique is that he, not only based his theories on himself, but was also on his patients. And those were not like a random sample of humans. Those were upper middle class Viennese women. And, maybe they had to say that they were unaware of their sexual impulses because, ladies don't have those. He also put a really strong emphasis on early environment and parenting, and research has showed that has less of an influence on personality than we thought. Freud's intellectual descendants kept this idea of psychosocial conflicts, a conflict between what you really want and what society wants that you have to resolve. So that's kind of key to these psychoanalytic theories. But his students, his intellectual descendants, moved away from the sex thing. You've probably heard of some of them. The idea of the inferiority complex, that people have like a sort of insecurity and they try to live their life in a way that assuages this. So you might see somebody in a fancy car and you sort of think, well, you know, what's he compensating for? That's a reference to Adler's idea of the inferiority complex. Carl Jung is associated with Freud. He was very influential, and I think he was in many ways more of a mystic than a scientist. Jordan Peterson is a big fan of Jung. Jung had this idea of a collective unconscious, almost like, without referring to genetics, a memories that have been like passed down from your ancestors, right? Like we recognize our mothers at birth because we've inherited a mother archetype. And he thought there was about 12 of these archetypes that he picked up from stories in many different cultures. And so, you know, there's a mother archetype, there's a ruler archetype, there's a hero archetype. Now, all of this can be true. Like we may have these characters that keep popping up, but that could be because of shared environmental experiences and not because of this collective unconscious that is hereditary exists. So you can observe that there's something that's real, like repressing a memory or an archetype being out there in stories, without having the fact that that exists support the theory about why it exists. Now, so that's the psychodynamic side of personality psychology. There were also the behaviorists, and the behaviorists were all about what they could observe. Behavior is observable action. And they thought that the most scientific thing that they could do was really focus on that, because we can't directly observe your thoughts and your feelings. And the radical behaviorists didn't even think that thoughts or feelings were that important. They didn't think that we should be measuring those. The really radical behaviorists would think that your thoughts and feelings might not even matter, because really everything you do is determined. Right? They were not believers in free will. They're determinists. Everything you do is determined by these contingencies that you've learned in the environment, being rewarded for this and punished for that. And in addition to just genetic hardwiring. Then this was criticized by social learning theorists like Albert Bandura, who saw the influence of the social environment as much more complex. So think about how the way your personality influences the way you interact with your environment, and therefore like how the environment reacts to you. Right? Sure, the environment has an influence on you, but you also have an influence on it. So let's say that you have a predisposition for neuroticism. So you're somebody that has more negative emotions. So maybe now you go out and there in the world and you're making negative attributions and entering into conflicts with people and you are interpreting ambiguous statements as if they were threatening, well, now people are going to react to you in like a kind of negative way because you've, say, threatened them or picked a fight or something. And now you're in some kind of a negative cycle, and that makes you feel even worse. So that's an example of reciprocal determinism. Your friends have an influence on you and your behavior, but what if you also pick who your friends are because you have compatible personalities, and that's based on your personality? See how there's this complex interplay between person and environment. Radical behaviorism has, been pretty discredited. And the strong emphasis of social learning theory on what the textbook calls shared environment, like other people's direct influence in say, child rearing, is not that strongly supported. Okay. We have talked about the psychodynamic view of personality, which is kind of negative. It's about how we have these sort of unacceptable drives and desires, and they're in conflict with the environment, and this is making us act in dysfunctional ways, and now we need to get psychotherapy to resolve that. It's really looking at, it's all based on dysfunction, right? Freud's ideas about personality are based on like his neurotic patients. So it's all about disease and dysfunction. The humanistic personality theories are much more positive about people. They have this idea that people are innately good. Psychology is a crossover discipline between philosophy and biology, and the idea of good is like a philosophical idea, right? Like, what is good? What is bad? What does it mean to be evil? What does it mean to be innately good? That is ultimately, those are ethical questions that come back to values. Anyway, Carl Rogers is one of the famous humanistic theorists, and he's seeing people as innately good and striving for growth. There's more philosophy there as well. You can ask what well-being is. And one way that some people see well-being, these are called eudaimonic theories of well-being, is as growth, right? As growing and learning. And maybe there could be some ideal point at which you have maximized your potential. Right? Probably heard people talking about this, about like discovering your true potential and being everything you can be and were made to be. These are some really vague, subjective ideas, by the way. Like, how would you know if somebody was self-actualized or not? Whether they had reached that pinnacle. Is that like a stable place that you achieve and stay there? Is it a moving target? There's no blood test or brain imaging procedure that says, yeah, okay, and this person is self-actualized. Carl Rogers had a description of what self-actualized people are like, and he based it on the biographies of people that he admired. So he really admired Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln is in that list. Gandhi is in that list. But are these people above any form of criticism? Like, Gandhi did some really amazing things. He's a major historical figure. Many people admire him, and he had admirable traits. But he was also racist and sexist. So there's bias in the fact that Carl Rogers picked his favorite people and then looked at biographies, and biographies are always subjective, like they're stories. They say something about people, they make interpretations, but somebody else could write a very different biography. So can you see the issues here with subjectivity? Anyway, he came up with a list, and that things like they have self-worth, they're a bit sort of disagreeable because they don't need to be popular, and they can stand up for things that they value. That is a personality trait. It's disagreeableness. Like, some people are willing to, sort of put their foot down and stand up for something. And I think it's important in leaders, because if you're a leader, you can't be conflict avoidant. You're going to piss some people off. However, why should I believe that people who are agreeable are not also like self-actualized? It's sort of suggesting that there's one kind of way to be, and it involves these leadership traits. And, that's not everyone. So there's a lot here that's not really very scientific. He also had this idea that people who are self-actualized have these peak experiences where they have these transcendent moments of excitement that are sort of marked by a profound sense of connection to the world. To me, that sounds like a serotonin trip, like that psychedelics that mess with the neurotransmitter serotonin give people those kind of experiences. Like that sounds like magic mushrooms to me. Roger thought that the personality had basically three elements. So you have your inherently good animal nature, and then you have your self-concept, your beliefs about who you are. I am a teacher and a parent and a graduate student. Okay. And then we have what he saw, I think justly, as very troublesome: conditions of worth, expectations you put on yourself. And really, these often correspond to social expectations to feel self-worth. And you may be falling short of many of these. And so he had this idea that people who were more distressed had more incongruence, a bigger gap between their actual self and the ideal self, and he wanted to close that gap. Can you guys think of any conditions of worth for me? Some kind of condition that you might feel you have to meet in order to be worthy. You might be ashamed of not having. So Grace suggests having like a certain grade point average, like your grades. Maybe you feel like you're a better person, or think you're a better person if you get higher grades. And so if you got low grades, maybe you could feel bad about yourself. Grace also suggests making a certain amount of money. So maybe we might think that we might admire rich people and think that, successful people are wealthy, and feel bad if we don't make enough money. I heard a story once about some very depressed children of a billionaire who just felt like failures because they were only millionaires. Right? They fell short. Yeah, Phoenix suggests having certain kinds of clothes or other material things. So having, you see people with these expensive handbags or the LV all over it, or the some kind of designer logos, and that communicates to other people that maybe they're a high status person because they own this high status thing. having a fancy car? Are you better if you're driving around in a fancy car? Having friends, being popular, having the high opinion and esteem of others. Maybe for males, I'm reading your contributions in the chat, not being physically strong enough, right? Not being smart enough. For girls, not being pretty enough, not being accomplished enough. Oh my goodness. So you guys are very, very aware of these conditions of worth, right? You gave me like a dozen of them. Right? And Grace suggests likes and followers on social media platforms. That's a reflection of approval. Right? People like us and what we do. Now, could imagine that the more of these you have and are trying to hold yourself to, the gap between what you are and your ideal self that has all these things, that meets all these conditions, could be troubling to you. Here's what we know about self-esteem, and right now I'm talking about the work of another clinical psychologist, Albert Ellis. The pursuit of self-esteem, right, pursuing these conditions, doesn't go anywhere good. If, let's say that you're chasing physical beauty, what's your life going to be like? You're always going to be looking at yourself in the mirror, and you'll be like, oh no, there's a wrinkle here and a hair there. And you see sort of pictures of yourself, you'll think, oh dear, I need to put a filter on that. You'll always be sort of troubled about it. And even if you achieve it, that feeling of emptiness, right, that hole that you're trying to fill is still going to be there. So you see people getting plastic surgery and they're not happy with it, and they get more and more plastic surgery and they start looking kind of weirder and weirder. People who are chasing money, they achieve a certain income level and they're just on to the next one, and they never have enough money. And if you're out for social approval, you're never going to have enough of it. And you're going to be really hurt and worried and upset about those times when, you said something weird on social media and somebody made a comment that was disapproving. Oh, how embarrassing and terrible, and you're so mortified. Right? Or, if you're out for beauty and now you start getting older and you can't keep your looks, let's get depressed about that. So say you lose that job in a layoff, or an economic downturn. Now you're going to be like really fragile. The first condition of worth that you guys shared was grade point average. Research shows that students who base their sense of self-esteem on their grades spend more time doing academic things. They spend more time studying. And they're also more likely to be anxious, more likely to be depressed, more likely to have sort of unpleasant conflicts, and they're more likely to have eating disorders. And it's all ultimately because you need to have secure self-worth that is not conditional on anything. And that is like one of the most radical things I think you can learn in psychology. And it's so freeing, because often other people, companies, blame capitalism will prey on these insecurities. Right? If you don't feel that you're pretty enough, well, now you have to buy all these clothes. Now you have to buy all that makeup. Right? If you don't feel rich enough, well, now you have to go and get a loan to try to start some enterprise. And can you see how it also makes you really vulnerable to exploitation? And so there's a tremendous amount of really unnecessary suffering and dis-ease that's based around these conditions of worth. So the ultimate way out of it, and many ethical systems, many religions have this, is to believe, and it's a choice that you make, that you are worthy, period. Now, as you are, not after you graduate, not when you meet the love of your life and get married, not once you've had children, not once you've met any of these conditions. Now, right? You are enough, you have enough, you do enough. Like if you can accept that, if you can actually make that decision, like you will have so much relief and so much freedom, including and like a lot more resilience to not meeting these conditions or having things taken away from you. It's also a lot easier to receive any kind of critical feedback if you have secure self-worth, because now it doesn't threaten you anymore. So what Albert Ellis strongly recommended is that you separate yourself as much as you can from your behavior. So your behavior is an action you took for whatever reason, and in some context, given some goal, it was effective or ineffective. Go ahead, Albert Ellis said, and rate your behavior. Right? Rate the way you answered that job interview question. If you want, go ahead and rate the way you studied for the midterm exam. But don't take any of that onto yourself. You don't rate yourself ever. There is no just or appropriate way to rate yourself. Like, let's say that you rate your self-worth on physical appearance. Well, is that really fair? Like, isn't that kind of like often misogynistic? Like, what's the ideal looking woman look like? What's that based on? Is it really fair to rate people on yourself on, let's say, money or class status? Like, isn't that classist? So there's no measure that would work well, that would be fair, that would be just. So don't do it. And also, if you can help it, don't do it with other people either. This idea of kind of separating the self from the behavior is almost like that religious idea of separating the sin from the sinner. So these ideas have been in philosophy for a long time. What that means is that your sense of self-worth should be the same if you get that date with your crush or if you are rejected. The same. The same if you get that great job or are fired. The same if you meet the love of your life or are single forever. The same if you are a hero in your community or you are in jail for doing something shameful. That is like, if you can actually do that and think like that, you will probably be much more effective in your behavior, because now you can look at it more objectively, right? And not get all sort of ego threatened about it. People whose self-worth is really wrapped up in their behavior and in these conditions of worth can be really hostile to any kind of feedback, because what they did or said can't be wrong, because they see it as they are wrong, and they can't tolerate that. People have a basic need to have some self-esteem. And so they have to think of all the ways that's not true and deny it and, do all the defense mechanisms. So you see a lot of dysfunction and a lot of disease because of these conditions of worth. And there's such an easy way out too. I think I've already talked about some of these criticisms of these humanistic theories, right? The self-actualization thing. Like, how do you really operationally define that and measure it? You sort of can't. This innately good thing. Well, actually, fear and malice are part of being human. Like, we all have a tendency for aggression. Like, Freud was right about that. And what would it mean to sort of to remove that? If you could, I don't know that would be a good thing. So it sort of doesn't see the dark side of humanity. And as you know from social psychology, it's actually really important to be aware of that in ourselves and in others. The textbook also mentions Maslow. Maslow is another big figure in the positive psychology movement, and he contributed the idea that there's this hierarchy of needs. And so once people meet their really basic needs, then they can go and meet higher level needs. And ultimately, the pinnacle is reaching this place of self-actualization. That pyramid that you see in all these textbooks is actually not in his original work. Maslow did his own work, and then people read it and interpreted it, and then people read the secondary citations of his original work, and it's the point where like people are talking about it without having read his original work, and it's the interpretations of Maslow have departed quite far from his original work. So that pyramid is there probably because it looks good on PowerPoint slides and it makes good multiple choice questions. And it also gives us like a framework for motivation, and textbooks often want to give you some kind of a theory. On to trait models. And some trait models are actually empirically based rather than theoretically based. I have, of the personality tests that I sent you, a couple of them, well, actually, maybe all of them are measuring traits. So a trait is like a predisposition to act in a certain way. Somebody with an extroverted trait has a predisposition to be friendly and outgoing. The first trait theorists were trying to list all the human traits. And they used a lexical approach. Think of going through the dictionary and trying to find all the words that describe people. There'd be like 18,000 of them. Well, what they noticed is that some terms are really kind of similar, right? If you were to measure this descriptor in people using a questionnaire, you might find that some traits have correlated scores. Maybe on average, people who are described as friendly also tend to be described as outgoing and like boisterous and colorful. And you would see that in the data as some of these items that measure the trait having high correlations with each other. And you could step back and look at that statistical factor and put a label on it. We could say, let's call that extroversion. And so researchers have come down to saying that there's like maybe 5 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 core factors of personality. And the most researched model is the 5-factor personality model. This is an example from your text about factor analysis. And in this particular example, you can see that, let's say, popularity and liveliness are highly correlated. So maybe these and sociability, so these would fall under the same factor, but they're not correlated with, risk-taking. Risk-taking and sensation-seeking, however, seem to be correlated with each other, and maybe that's another factor. Maybe that's what they're trying to express in that table. So the most used trait model is the 5-factor model that is described with the acronym OCEAN or CANOE. And openness is kind of about interest in abstract, maybe artistic things, new things, weird things. Conscientiousness is often about being kind of maybe detail-oriented, rule-following. Conscientious students get higher grades. They do their homework. Extroversion includes sort of gregariousness, among other things. Agreeableness comes down to how pleasant other people find you. And neuroticism is about the tendency to express negative emotions. We'll talk more about these next day. I sent you the 5-factor model and also a 6-factor model. And these personality tests do have some predictive value. There's a question about how well they generalize across cultures, especially when you think that if you consider that they're based on adjectives from the English language, right? Like, are there things terms, adjectives, words that were not included because they define something that only Chinese people experience or Hungarian people? Those are valid criticisms. So I've also sent you the Hexaco. The Hexaco has an additional factor of honesty, humility. And so one of the big differences in the Hexaco is that it pulls, sorry, I'm really tired. It has a bit of a different way of conceptualizing agreeableness. So think of being disagreeable as somebody that, pisses people off. Well, you could be doing that for self-interested reasons that harm other people and that are kind of unethical, or you could be doing that for sort of ethical reasons, right? Carl Rogers was making this point that actually, you shouldn't be too concerned about pleasing people when you're trying to sort of do good in the world. And so the trait factor of honesty, humility explains that a bit. So I'll talk about that more next class. I see that I have about less than 10 minutes and I am super tired. Okay, so the key point is that the Hexaco adds honesty and humility. Some researchers have tried to sort of collapse the 5-factor model a bit. Some would say that, actually we can lump agreeableness and conscientiousness and low openness together because these are all a bit about impulse control. Right? Maybe somebody who's highly agreeable is a bit, better behaved, as is somebody who is conscientious. Why low openness? People who are low in openness are more traditional, right? A bit more conservative. So maybe those 3 things can be lumped together. And then you still have the other 2 factors of extroversion and neuroticism, and that makes it a big 3. And then someone has said, well, hey, maybe the only 2 dimensions that really matter are about interpersonal behaviors. Okay, so maybe it's all about extroversion, which is about sort of dominance, and agreeableness, which is arguably about sort of submission. Could be another way of looking at it. And other researchers have suggested different combinations as well. Personality, as you know, it's quite hereditary and it is pretty stable. There are some things that change. It takes a lot of energy to be disagreeable. People get more agreeable as they get older. We are rewarded for being conscientious, so conscientiousness tends to increase a bit. And, we chill a bit, so we get less neurotic over time. Textbook makes a really interesting point about how taking psychoactive medications could change your personality. So you could look at an anxiety disorder through a personality lens and say this person has an anxious personality. And let's say they're put on an anxiolytic and now they're more chill. Did that drug just change their personality? Historically, there's been many different ways that people have tried to measure personality, and they've been historically important, but many of them have been flawed. People have tried to measure personality through sort of features, through like body types, through blood type. Blood type is a popular thing in Japan. There's an idea that like people who have blood type A's have a certain kind of personality, but there's no validity to that. The tests that I have sent you are all structured personality tests. They have kind of started with some rational or theoretical method where the researchers believe that there's a trait out there and they're asking you a question about it. So when you answer the question about, I don't know, maybe whether, so there's one on the MBTI that asks whether it's easy for you to make new friends. They're after something there. And what they're after is the measurement of extroversion. So if you say, yes, very likely, then, and you do that to all of those questions, the test is going to clock you as an extrovert. There are differences in reliability and validity between these tests. One of the worst tests, and it's one that I sent you, is the MBTI. The questions are so vague that you could answer them different ways just by how you interpret them. And it's such an issue that the same person can take the test twice and then get different personality results. So I think this is a case where the theory behind the MBTI is actually a lot better than the test. And so I would encourage you to type yourself by thinking about, what it means to be an extrovert. And, do you feel that you are or not? That might be better than taking the test and deciding if you're an extrovert or an introvert based on the score that you got on that measure, because the questions are so, well, questionable. Researchers or therapists, psychologists have also tried to measure personality using projective tests. And the idea is that if we show you something ambiguous, like an ink blot, that says something about your personality. So what do you see in this ink blot? And the idea is that means something about you. Other projective tests might ask you to like draw a person. And let's say you drew big eyes on the person. So then maybe now I assume that means you're a suspicious person. That involves a ton of inference, right? And it's really quite biased, and there is little to no evidence to support its validity. Another example of this is the thematic apperception test. In this test, you're asked to kind of tell a story about like what's going on in the picture. And the idea is the same. We're going to make inferences about your personality based on what you say. I think this has the potential to be very dangerous because, like, what's the check or balance on the therapist or the psychoanalyst's interpretation? Like, let's say that you're giving this test to somebody that's seeking parole, and they say something that makes them sound that's a bit suspicious. Well, now do you not trust them to be released? So I worry about the implications of using unvalid tests in contexts where there's power differentials. Many people are easily sold on tests that lack validity. The astrology offers these sort of star signs. That's a personality theory. It says that there are 12 different kinds of personalities, and then it tries to predict your behavior or your future based on these horoscopes. The horoscopes are written in ways that are so vague. They make statements that could be true of you, of anyone, no matter what. You know, if a horoscope said something like, today you will feel some excitement, that's probably true. And so Barnum statements are statements that are pretty much true for everyone. And this example here is from a famous experiment by Forer, where people took a test and then they were all given the same results. They thought they were personal results. And I think about like 85% of subjects thought that it was like a really good test that described them well. And these are basically statements that are true for anyone, right? Like, you have a tendency to be critical of yourself. Like, we all do that. Okay, most people have a need for others to like them, right? Like, most people feel, question themselves. Okay, so these are just generally true for most people. And so this Barnum effect probably explains why people really can believe in tests that result predictions that aren't valid. And this might explain why, tarot card readings can feel like they're really accurate, because they make general statements that are, you think about how it applies to you and you find a way that it does. You're like, oh yeah, that this is how that could be true, rather than being kind of critical about it. Anyway, we are at time. Thank you for your attention. Please complete those personality tests, and I look forward to talking about them next class.